Miser Catulle, desi nas ineptire, et quod vides per isse perditum ducas. Falsere quondam candidi tibi soles, cum venti tabas, quo puella ducebat, amata nobis, quanta mabitur nulla, ibilla multa, cum jocosa fiebant, quae tu volebas, nec puella nolebat. Falsere vere candidi tibi soles, nunc illa non vult, tu quoquim potens noli, nec quae fugit sectare, nec miser vive, sed obstinata, mente perfer odora, vale puella, iam Catullus abdorat, nec te requerit, nec rogabit in vitam, at tu dolebis, cum rogaberis nola, scelesta, vitae, quae tibi manet vita, quis nunc tatibit, qui videber is bella, quem nunc amabis, quius esse diceris, quem basiabis, qui la bella mordebis, at tu, Catulle, destinatus abdora. Wretched Catullus, you should cease to be silly, and you should consider that which you see to have perished is lost. The happy sons once shone for you, when you were coming often to where the girl, having been loved by us as much as no woman will be loved, was leading. There, when those many playful things were happening, which you were wanting and the girl was not refusing, truly the happy suns shone for you. Now, at last, that girl does not want. You, also, powerless, do not wish. Do not chase after her, she who flees. Nor be wretched, but endure with a determined mind. Be resolute. Goodbye, girl. Now Catullus is resolute, and he will not miss you, nor will he court you unwilling. But you will be sorry, when you no longer will be courted. Wicked woman, woe to you! What life awaits for you? Who will now approach you? To whom will you seem pretty? Whom will you now love? Whose will you be said to be? Whom will you kiss? For whom will you nibble the little lips? But you, Catullus, determined, be resolute. In recent centuries, according to Robert Schmiel, author of The Structure of Catullus 8, The History of Interpretation, the conception of how Catullus 8 has been structured has mutated. Throughout the decades, different theories arose concerning how the poem is best divided into parts, whether or not symmetry in the line exists, and what line is the best pivot for the action in the poem. This transformation of opinion has taken over a century. This change in interpretation of the structure, interestingly enough, correlates with the voice of Catullus 8 itself, which clearly morphs into various tones and ideas throughout the poem. Just as the manner in which Catullus speaks to himself and treats himself in Catullus 8 shifts, so has the scholarly opinion on how these changes in Catullus' speech take place. The voice of Catullus and how he addresses himself switches into many different forms. The first two lines of Catullus 8 implore Catullus to get over this pain that he is feeling, describing it as simply silly. He tells himself in a very stern tone that he must overcome the love that once was, even admitting that it has been destroyed. The Catullus of the first two lines seems to be an older figure, perhaps even a fatherly figure, who tries to pull him out of his depression through a forceful tone. The voice of Catullus suddenly changes to that of the romantic, who recalls in this splendid imagination how happy he once was. From lines 3 through 8, Catullus introduces and ends this whole nostalgic episode with nearly identical lines, so as to better distinguish that passage from the rest of the poem. This distinct voice of Catullus relapses into his past feelings for Lesbia, and the stern Catullus who previously held the conversation gives way to the passionate youth who reminisces about his one love. In these lines, in fact, Catullus makes use of more short syllables in the scansion where variable syllables can be short. This metrical pattern demonstrates how this Catullus cannot wait to disclose his memories and to ponder what once was. The repeated lines 3 and 8 which begin and end this speech also harken back to line 4 of Catullus 5 when Catullus was deeply in love with Lesbia. This instance demonstrates how this voice of Catullus still deeply cares for her. This old stern Catullus then takes charge again over the passionate Catullus in order that he may better flush Lesbia out of his head. Lines 9 through 11 are riddled with imperatives, implying a powerful tone that attempts to resolve Catullus's broken spirit. Youthful Catullus returns for lines 12 through 18, clearly influenced by the other voice of Catullus, and seems to have resolved the issue of Lesbia. From lines 12 through 14, the formerly nostalgic Catullus really does seem resolute in getting over his past love, especially by the use of the word obdurat, which, in the imperative form, the stern Catullus uses repeatedly. This facade, however, begins to break down in lines 15 through 18, when the young Catullus starts asking those rhetorical questions. The young Catullus's mask is hidden until line 18, when it becomes clear that by the use of the diminutive labella, usually used as a means to convey affection, that he is in fact not overcome his passion for Lesbia. The stern Catullus then returns for line 19 to retrieve the lover from his digression into his emotional stupor. Just as Catullus changes his voice in Catullus 8, the scholarly reception has morphed several times over a century and a half. The perception of poetic architecture has changed since the 1860s numerous times. In this period of time, scholars split Catullus 8 into short 2 to 3 line sequences, although some, such as R. Ellis, thought that the last 5 lines of the poem should be grouped together, so the theory that Catullus 8 was made up of sequences of lines of contended but usually small length stood for about 60 years until in 1929, when Friese determined the blockier structure of 838, while at the same time suggesting that the divisions need not be made of equal parts. This symmetrical construction was soon refuted by Rebert in 1931, who perceived through his reading of the emotion in the poem the structure 26551, returning to the conception that the 1860s had about how the poem should be formatted. Swanson, in 1962 through 1963, had first based his structure on the verbal formation of the poem as opposed to what he saw as the emotional effect. He did not claim a solid structure, instead claiming that the poem points out the lines 9 through 11 as a central pivot to the poem. Roland, in 1966, divides the poem closer to how I would have done it. Using the overall message of each line, he comes up with a structure 2-6-3-2-5-1. Since the lines 9 through 11 are widely regarded as their own section of the poem, this opinion held until 1990, when Robert Schmiel, author of the article I based this argument on, suggested that the first part of line 12, especially Vale Puella, was the actual pivot of the poem. The conception of how Catullus 8 is formed clearly is continuously morphing. Indeed, this mutation correlates with how we believe Catullus 8 changes itself. Just as Catullus 8 has divisible parts, so history has separated into different eras of ideas, with some ideas recurring as words are repeated in the poem.